I'm podcasting from my car. It is Friday. I'm excited. Actually, it's Thursday night, but we're getting ready for Friday. So here we go. In this episode, I'm going to address some of the challenges of having a podcast and how to get past those challenges. Tune in. This is the Podcast in the Rough. Tune in every Friday for new adventurous episodes. All right, welcome back to the Podcast in the Rough. I'm your host, Zebulon Thomas, and this is episode 119. And today I want to address some of the challenges of having a podcast. And so I want to help you get past these challenges as fast as possible. So we're going to dive right in. When it comes to podcasting, there is a level of commitment that you have to have, regardless of the amount of time that it takes. You have to commit to this. And you can do this as little or as much as you want. And that's one of the biggest challenges of podcasting is consistency and time. When you commit to this, you have to early on decide how you want your podcast to be at its core. How much time can you dedicate to this? How consistent can you be? Now listen, content is king, and being consistent is going to get you more exposure, faster growth in the shortest amount of time. But that takes a lot of dedication and commitment, but it also takes strategy. And so if I can help you implement some strategies to speed up that time management workflow to give you consistency so that you don't fall off, that will give you more success with your podcast. And so the first thing that I highly recommend when doing a podcast, if you're just starting out or you've been doing this for a while, have a schedule. Set the schedule. For me, I know that I can commit to a podcast every Friday. And a lot of times what I'd like to do is when I find a day where I'm really, really motivated, I'm really feeling it, I will set aside a little bit more time to record back-to-back episodes. Usually I get 2 in, sometimes I can get 3, but I don't try to wear myself down. I get 2 in, and then immediately I jump on the editing of those 2 because it's pointless to do 2 episodes and then just edit one of them this week because then you're editing another one next week. Especially if you're doing a schedule like mine and you have all this other stuff that fills in your week very, very fast. And you're being pulled in a lot of different directions to serve. So I have to make sure that I'm consistent. And that doesn't mean that these have to be long episodes. They could be shorter ones. And shorter is powerful. Longer ones, if you're giving more information and laying out more blueprint, telling a story, or really giving them some really great value that's juicy, right? Shorter if you have the information you need and you want to cut out all the fluff, slay the dragons, and pack a punch. If you can fit that in 5 minutes, it's going to be great, which is what I'm attempting to do in this episode today, right? So get a schedule, write it down and say, I'm going to record my episodes on this day, and I'm going to produce my podcast to the public on this day. So I'm going to record, say, Monday, and I'm going to release that podcast Thursday or Friday. And I'm going to commit to that. And I'm going to make sure that these podcasts have the value that's needed. And I'm going to make sure that I'm consistent when I post these podcasts. I don't want to miss any episodes. I want to continuously grow. Now, if you're going to do a daily podcast, I would say shorter podcasts are going to be more effective for you. 5-10 minute podcast, if that, because you're doing this daily. Jump on, add value, talk about the topics that you want to talk about, or whatever your podcast has to offer. Do it in 5-minute increments and share that on your social media outlets. That's going to be a great way to grow very fast in a short amount of time with minimal commitment and time. Next is the technical aspects of podcasting and the equipment needed to deliver a quality episode, to deliver a quality show, to grow something of value. So think about this. I do say that you could start a podcast with no budget. You can start a podcast by simply using your cell phone, and you can make that work, even with minimal editing. But what you want to do is fine-tune and polish your episodes so that they sound good, so that when you look back at your podcast, it really is something of value, and the audio is clean, crisp, and with quality. So if you're really thinking about doing podcasting for a long term, and it's something that you want to grow and dive into, then by all means, definitely dive into it. And I have an episode, and I'll put it in the link below in the description of this episode, that you can go and learn about all the different microphones that I currently own and use and how they sound. And this will also help you decide on the budget you need to build this out. Again, you can get away with a minimal budget and not spend a lot and have great quality microphones and mixers, and you'll sound good. But what it really comes down to is, regardless of the microphone and the mixer that you use, is the editing. Get really good at editing and find a software that works for you. Something that allows you to add plugins later down the line if you need it. Get familiar with the software you're using to edit your podcast and use things like normalizing, de-plosives, de-hisses, loudness control, and an EQ to really clean up the sound of your podcast. And then go in there and slay the dragons, right? Go in there and eliminate extra noise, extra air in between words. If you messed up, cut it out. Really polish that podcast so now it's a show and it has value in the sound. Because if your podcast doesn't sound crisp and clean, or if you have a lot of baggage in your vocabulary that isn't getting to the point, then that's going to hurt your growth of your podcast and your listeners aren't going to stick around. You want your podcast to come off with a high quality sound, and you also want to cut out some of the stuff that you might say that isn't really getting to the point. Even I'm a talker, and sometimes I'm long-winded, and I can go on for a long time about a topic. But when I go back and I listen to my episode that I recorded, a lot of it gets dumped and cut out. And I go back and listen to myself and other people's podcasts to really retrain myself to only think in the way of editing. Think like, oh, in my mind, I could cut out this whole part. I don't even need to talk about it. So we just jump right into the next subject, or we just get more detailed with the topic without having extra fluff. So learn how to mix and master all your episodes with a technical aspect, and that'll solve that challenge that a lot of people face when podcasting. Remember, the quality of the sound of your podcast is very important when it comes to growing a professional podcast that people will enjoy, subscribe, listen to, share, and come back to constantly. If you're going to put in all the effort, you might as well have good quality. So make sure to invest in the right equipment and understand the equipment that you're using to grow that podcast. One of the other challenges of podcasting is growth. How do you grow this thing? How do you get this podcast to reach all the people that you want to reach, all those prospects? Well, that takes effective marketing, strategizing how you're going to get your message across, how you're going to get it out there. You can't get by just by posting on your own social media platforms. You're going to need some help from your friends. So if you deliver a podcast that is quality, if you have diehard fans or really good friends that are going to share your podcast, that's going to really help you get it out there. And it's going to show the algorithm that it needs a push. And it's going to help that push. Some of the other things you want to think about is, how can I market my podcast? This also plays into the time management because it's going to take some more time. But if you set up all your graphics and some of the things you can say and practice talking about your podcast, then it won't take a lot of time for you to go to Facebook and do a post and write something really nice saying, here's my newest episode. This is the podcast. Did you miss it? Tune in. Check this out. Like, share, and subscribe. Give them something to listen to. Give them something to talk about and encourage them to comment below. That's going to be your first form of marketing that's going to be really good, that's in your wheelhouse of power. You can do that. Second to that is finding a way to get your podcast to reach other people by sending that in a form of a newsletter, putting that onto a website, micromanaging that SEO so the score is high and it's easily searchable and it ranks high in the search, looking at your Google Analytics, using keywords and hashtags on all your posts, including your website, including each post on your podcast platform. In the descriptions, making sure your descriptions are about the podcast. There's a lot of information out there that you can research to find out what's really going to help. And this information is constantly changing because the internet, the algorithm, the platforms, it's constantly changing. So you have to keep changing with this and adapting your podcast to the new times. So with that being said, some things like simple stuff like using YouTube as a platform to get your podcast more exposure. If you can't start with video, then just take the audio format, put a nice image up, and throw it on to YouTube and create that YouTube channel. And then underneath that, use the tags and make sure you title your podcast episode with something that is relevant to your topic and is something that's possibly trending. Find some keywords that will fit inside your title of your episode that will grab the algorithm's attention, that will grab other people's attention. And then micromanage that thumbnail so that it looks good and it stands out. Research these things. And if you need more help, again, I'm here for you by simply joining my podcast community mastermind group on Facebook. And you can do that by going to thepodcastintherough.com/learn. I would love to see you inside the group, and we talk about this in more depth, and I'm here to help. If you need that boost, there's a community there. We will support you. There's some other things that you can do to help grow your podcast, and that's by finding a way to put yourself as a guest on other people's show and then allowing them to ask you key questions and finding the opportunity to plug your own podcast. That will give you more reach and more value. Second to that, to get more growth, having other people on your podcast that have bigger networks or have more reach or have more interest, interview them as a guest on your podcast. And then when you share it, they will share it, and it gets a lot more traction in a short amount of time. And that's going to be another very important way to grow your podcast. But it's not impossible. You can do it. And just know that sometimes this is a long-term play. You could do short-term goals, but in the end, this is all a long-term play. I tend to look at my podcast in the form of seasons. Season 1. This is everything we did in season 1. This is the goal for season 1. To get to this maximum goal at the end of the year, these are the little micro goals and the little micro shifts that we have to do and hit in order to achieve that goal. So you can't just go into a podcast, maybe at the very beginning, just kind of winging it. You really do want to schedule this and get things down and get a clear vision of where you want to go with this podcast. Where do you want it to be in a year? What kind of numbers you want to have? Well, how many listeners, views, subscribers? How many outlets do you want to be on? Who do you want to have as guests? How many episodes do you want to produce within this year? What's the quality of these episodes? How will they improve over time? What does the graphics look like? Did you improve your logo? Do you have a logo? How is that happening? Are you building a community? How involved is your community in the podcast and the development of that podcast? These are very important things because if you open the door for the community to get involved and you have more people sharing ideas and feeling like they're a part of your growth process, it's going to help your podcast grow even more. And at the end of that, it's going to give you diehard fans that are committed to you, your podcast, and they hold on to every single word that you say. And that's something that gives you power to be able to lead them to serve in the manner in which your podcast is meant for and the purpose of your podcast. Last but not least, let's talk about the challenge of podcast. It comes down to money. Sometimes people don't start a podcast because they have lack of money. Sometimes people start a podcast because they have an abundance of money. And it doesn't mean that podcast, whether you have no money, it's going to be bad. And if you have abundance of money and you throw all the money in the world at it and get the best tech and gear and the best team, it's going to be good. And that's not true. I've worked with several people and have grown so many different podcasts that even the ones that spent thousands of dollars on their podcast a year, they didn't have a good podcast. They weren't able to grow it. It just wasn't there for them because they weren't committed enough. They didn't take the time. They put all this onto their team. The team didn't want it enough. No one knew the value. No one had an end goal. No one even knew what the purpose was besides just, hey, everyone else has got a podcast. We should get one too. And you know what? We're going to win this by paying to play. You can't always pay to play. Now, if everybody was committed, they had a common goal, they knew what the purpose was, and they had a strategy behind it, then they threw their money at it, it would have worked. I also seen people that had no money, that was just talking into their phones, had a great idea, no strategy behind it, not knowing what they're talking about. They put it up online and everybody ate it up, and it was so good that then it turned into something. And they said, you know what, let's format this into a really great show. What is the gold nuggets in what I've made so far that's made this successful? And we figure that out and we continuously test that, grow that, and produce it. And then that makes money, and then we can evolve. So I'm just saying, wherever you're starting at, don't worry about the money. Try to get your podcast going without spending a lot of money, but do invest in something. Because when you invest in anything, you have a better chance of committing to it because now you're locked in. You've given something to commit to that. When you don't have any money down on the line and you got nothing to lose, you're most likely not going to commit to this. When you get a busy week come through, you're like, I can wait. I'm not going to do this. It can happen next week. Listen, I'm saying that because I've done that too. A couple weeks ago, I missed a week because I was just too busy and I could have squeezed in a shorter episode, but I figured, you know what? I'm not going to stress myself. I'm going to push it back. But I did take to my social media to let everyone know, no episode this week. I'm going to follow up with a really strong one next week. If you have any questions, let's start the conversation. And inside my Facebook groups, inside my other groups, my Buy Me a Coffee, all of that, I started communicating a little bit more if anybody needed help. And some people asked some questions. They were good questions that helped me thrive to build a better episode for the following week. So it was good. But not all the times do I want to do that. I want to continuously drive content that you can absorb and apply to your life right now. So that's what I did with this podcast. Even tonight, I was like, you know what? I'm really busy. Everybody's going to bed. It's kind of late. I had a lot of work to get done this week. Friday's tomorrow. I got to get it done. I can't spend a lot of time on editing this. I need it to be done right. So then I said, you know what? I'm jumping in the car, perfect sound booth. I need to be in my zone, and I need minimal editing. So I'm using my Shure SM58 microphone and my PodTrack P4 mixer by Zoom. It's a great little handy mobile setup, and I jumped in my car. So I don't have to worry about a lot of heavy EQ to make this thing sound good. It's going to sound great. And you know what? Again, check out that episode, link in the description below, about the microphones. You can hear how this sounds. Pick the one that works for you. But I'm telling you, this one's the best bang for the buck. This whole setup, it's going to do you really well. I have many people that I've referred this setup to, and they've picked up the ball and ran with it, and they sound great, and they're getting it done, and there's room for improvement. But the fact is, they're being consistent, they're staying on it, and they're moving. And that's what I encourage you to do. So I want to first off just congratulate you for getting to this point in my podcast, to listening to this and going, wow, I've absorbed this. Now go apply it. Go have fun on your weekend and start your podcast. And those of you who have started your podcast that are well on your way, congratulations. You're moving forward, and soon you're going to reach the 1-year anniversary of starting your podcast. And I want you to have a big celebration. So maybe think about that. What's the big 1-year celebration party that you can involve your community and all that you've built online, and get other people involved and say, hey, join us. Maybe that's a public event. Maybe it's an online event, or maybe it's just a very special podcast episode. Maybe this will give you something to think about as a long-term goal coming up, that you're like, you know what? We've been doing this for a year now coming up. We should do a big special episode and give thanks and tell people about some of the things we learned, some of the challenges we had to overcome, some of the stuff that we got stumped by and we got stopped, some of the things we had to pivot and shift. You know, what has this experience been like, this journey? If you're someone listening to this and you're in my private community groups or part of my Buy Me a Coffee as a member, and you're getting that premium content, be sure to comment and share your ideas. I'd love to be a part of that with you and see what that looks like for your big anniversary for your podcast. That's all I have for you today. I appreciate you in so many ways for supporting this podcast. And one of the ways you can support this podcast that I would really love is to simply just go to any one of the platforms or to thepodcastintherough.com and write a review and rate this podcast. That will help me reach more people, and it will help me grow this podcast. And I appreciate you, and I appreciate your time on that. Tune in next week for another episode of The Podcast in the Rough. Talk to you next week. This is the Podcast in the Rough.